You're watching Hindustan Times Insight, and I have with me the paper's editor-in-chief, Sukumar Ranganathan, once again. Now, if you have been in Uttarakhand over the last couple of weeks, you would have firsthand witnessed the devastation caused by the incessant rains, the cloudburst, the flooding in that state. Even if you've not been there, we've seen scary visuals which have been pouring out on social media from that particular state of the devastation that the rains and the flooding have caused in the region. We've seen visuals of entire pakka houses being swept away by the rivers, by the floodwaters. And I have with me, Sukumar, the most common question, Sukumar, right now is, which people are asking, is really, is this because of climate change? Because this is not really the time for these kind of rains in that region or in Kerala, which we've seen this year, earlier over the weekend. So how do you, would you attribute this to the climate crisis?
You can attribute anything that's happening right now to the climate crisis at a macro level. But I think it's very important to contextualize what's happening in Uttarakhand and what's happening in Kerala, which is pretty much the same. And there's an easy way to explain everything, which is to go back to 2011, when a report on the Western Ghats came out. It was put out by one of India's preeminent ecologists, Madhav Gadgil, and he pointed to everything that had been going wrong with the Western Ghats in terms of development, in terms of mining, in terms of construction, in terms of commercial use of forest land, basically deforestation for timber, for other resources, everything else. What was happening and how this could affect the entire states of Maharashtra, Goa, Kerala, all the states which are along the Western Ghats. And if you look at what's happening in Kerala now, everything that was said in that report is coming true. 2018 they had floods in Kerala, 2019 they had floods in Kerala, 2020 they had floods in Kerala, and 2021 they had floods in Kerala. These are just not floods. Along with the floods, you have landslides. The same thing is happening in Uttarakhand. Now, what is the common explanation given? Every time something like this happens, people immediately say cloudburst, right? I mean, it's like just blame it on, right? Cloudburst and basically too much rain in too little time, and the place is gone. That too much rain and too little time. Cloudburst is a technical term, and many of these are not cloudbursts, so these people are wrong. But what has been happening is you've been seeing extremely high rainfall. You've been seeing a large volume of rainfall in a very limited period of time. It's been happening even with the normal southwest monsoon. And we've written extensively about it. We've talked about it in the past on how the number of days on which it rains has come down, but the volume of rain remains pretty much the same, which means extreme events are increasing, right? Now, this causation of extreme rainfall is directly attributable to the climate crisis. So, why is it raining so heavily in Uttarakhand increasingly over the last 5-6 years? Climate crisis, and this is laid down scientifically. If you look at the latest IPCC report, also warns of India being vulnerable to extreme rainfall events. And what you're seeing in Uttarakhand, what you've seen in Kerala, is nothing but extreme rainfall events. Now, the question is, if we knew this was happening, why couldn't we prevent the devastation that followed? And the answer to that is very simple. We have followed a very myopic model of development, especially in these states that are abutting the hills and the forests. So if you go back to the Madhav Gadgil report on the Western Ghats, speaks of it actually characterizes these states into various zones depending on how much of a danger they face or how vulnerable they are. And one of the factors that they point to is If there is a lot of rainfall and if the area is steep and if the vegetation cover is either not adequate or has gone down over a period of time because of commercial activities, there is a huge risk of landslides. And that is exactly what has happened in Kerala repeatedly over the last 4 years. And that is exactly what is happening in Uttarakhand.
So you've spoken about the Gadkil report, and you've spoken about the fact that it lists out all these things. It lists out things to do. Is anybody doing those things? Because what I understand is that that report is really been put on the back burner by the powers that be.
No, I think not. And now let's come more to Uttarakhand than to Kerala, right? I mean, because the crisis that we've seen is much more in Uttarakhand than in Kerala. This is not like the 2018 once in a century floods that happened in Kerala. So in Uttarakhand, among the various unfortunate anecdotal events that we've seen over the last week, one of these is, of course, an entire resort being flooded, right? I mean, in Cobbett, completely flooded, and everyone said, "Oh my God, look at this! The resort has been flooded." And there's a very simple reason why this happened, because the resort was built on the floodplain. I mean, it was built where a river is supposed to have a natural rite of passage, and you've blocked that and you've built your resort there. Clearly, when there is high rainfall, the river will flood, because what falls down has to flow somewhere, right? I mean, that's how the whole hydrological cycle operates.
Let's talk about the specific man-made reasons behind these. I mean, there is, yes, the climate change and global warming and all of that, which really you do have an effect, you do have a role to play there, but at a very macro level. But at a local level, what can we do to sort of get the ecology? There is unplanned development. We talked about what happened at Cobbett. There's unscientific road cutting, for instance. Those are the kind of things that have happened. How do we plan better, and how do we, for this ecological damage at local levels, which is really causing the maximum devastation in many regions?
See, the unfortunate aspect about this is, in many cases, it's irreversible, right? You take Nainital, for instance, where the lake flooded over. And you've seen what has happened around the lake. Anyone who's been in that area knows what has happened around the lake. It is just completely unplanned and unchecked development that has happened. It's not illegal. Some of it could also be illegal, but in this case, even legally, I think there has been so much despoiling of the environment that has happened in that place that there's very little that you can do now. Would removing these structures help over a period of time? Perhaps, right? I mean, can you rewild some of the places where forests have been removed? Yes, you can. It will take time. But what are all the things that you've done? In some cases, you've blocked rivers. In some cases, you've covered rivers. And this is not just true of Uttarakhand and Kerala, right? I mean, these are the flashpoints that you're seeing, but there are lots of flashpoints that you're not seeing. Why did the Chennai floods a few years back, why were they so horrible? They were horrible because the entire floodplain had been taken over. Why does Bangalore repeatedly flood over? Because the lakes of Bangalore, which were part of the natural water discharge and recharge mechanism, have been completely built over, right? In many cases, the lakes have been filled and built over. And you're seeing the same thing that happened in those places happening here. Take the Chardham project, for instance. It's a strategically important project, according to the army, because it will enable our soldiers get quickly to the border. It connects 4 pilgrimage sites. But the unfortunate aspect is the only way you're going to build this is by cutting into hills. Now, if you cut into hills, of course, you're going to ruin the forest there, everything else. But the people you're eventually putting in danger are yourself, because you're going to be using the road, and the people of the region, because the hills cannot take that kind of cutting that you're doing right now, right? I mean, you have to, if you have to build roads, they will have to be narrow roads. If you're going to have to build these nice broad roads, you're going to have major problems. This is what has happened in some parts of Kerala. This is what has happened in Uttarakhand. And this will increasingly happen. There's a third aspect, which is if you looked at these places at one point in time, especially Uttarakhand, population intensity was low. The population intensity was low for a reason. It worked that way, right? The remote places, fairly difficult to get to. So when the intensity is low, the demands on everything else are also low. When the intensity is high, it immediately places an extra demand on water, on power, on garbage disposal, on just about everything. What you're seeing in Uttarakhand now, interestingly, in the Kumaon, and this is a place which has not really been affected as much as the Garhwals have. And the Garhwal region has been affected by this for quite some time. A lot of people have been buying real estate there. A lot of people have been building holiday homes there. A lot of people have just moved in there. I'm told the real estate market in the hills is quite hot. Everyone wants a second home. It's affordable in many ways. It's either Goa or the hills for many people who live in the cities. It's like a dream. Unfortunately, the dream is built on fairly shaky ground because you're cutting into the hillside. Many of these places have a huge water problem. We've seen what Himachal, for instance, another state which saw landslides not too long back. I mean, that was when were the Himachal? June and July, right? They had issues there. And again, a state which is perennially short of water. Shimla almost ran out of water a few years ago. So you're going to see this again and again.
You know, when you're pointing these things out, it's for a country the length and breadth and the size of India, tackling these things at a local level and a national level seems like a lot of hard work and seems like an insurmountable challenge if you have to really tackle the ecological as well as the climate crisis, and maybe climate change and requisite measures are really not top priority and for any successive government. They've not really been up there in terms of priorities. How can India, sort of meet this challenge head on? Because these extreme weather events are going to really continue from here on, and there is a huge loss of life and property associated with it.
It's a good question. See, I mean, take COVID for instance, and everyone's talking about 1 billion doses of vaccines, and everyone realized early on that the vaccines were the only way to fight the disease because you had to go to source. It didn't make sense to allow people to get infected and then treat the illness, which is what we do when it comes to floods and natural disasters. We treat the symptoms. We don't go to the cause. Fairly simple to go to the cause. It's not very difficult at all. The difficult part of it is the kind of political will that it requires. Why didn't the Gadgil report get implemented, especially in Kerala? Because of politics, right? I mean, no government wants to impose these measures which are seen to be anti-development, which seem to be going against the local sentiments of the public. But who's at risk? The people at risk are the same people who say, like, we want to exploit these resources. So you have to achieve a balance in terms of development. There have to be some no-go zones. There has to be a clear labeling of ecologically sensitive zones around the country. And I think you should have very strict rules for these places. You can't have broad roads. You can't have people simply buying houses on the hillside. You can't cut down forests on hillsides for anything, because what that does is it loosens the soil. So when there are heavy rains, landslides automatically happen, which is what has happened in Kerala, which is what has increasingly happened in Uttarakhand this year, which is what happened in Himachal some time back. So, but we know the solutions, but the solutions require political will. We can't address climate change, right? I mean, that is a much broader discussion. We are trying to address it, but for that, we'll have to make commitments on emissions. We'll have to find carbon extinguishing technologies, make huge investments and everything else. So that is a much longer play. In this case, what we can do is we can stop unchecked development. Stop it right now, right? I mean, what's happened has happened. Stop it right now. Don't allow any further development in these areas. Going to be very tough politically. Uttarakhand goes to the polls next year. So at least till the polls, they're not going to be doing anything. What they're going to be doing is addressing the symptom, these floods, and saying, great, we'll give you money to rebuild, we'll give you this, and paper over the cracks. And I can tell you today, it will happen again next year. If it doesn't happen next year, it will happen the year after. And you're going to see more of this in Kerala, you're going to see more of this in Uttarakhand unless we change.
Yeah, unfortunately, we are always, as a country, always in election mode, either national elections or regional elections, and there will always be these political compulsions. So, on that grim note, I think we should end today's discussion, and I hope our viewers have found this informative, and maybe, all of us can do our bit at our own levels and also pressurize the government of the day, whichever government is in power, to do their bit. Thank you so much for joining us for this broadcast. Stay tuned to HindustanTimes.com.